Welcome to the PIDE webinar. As you know, we hold many webinars a week, primarily because we want to focus on developing a conversation on the Pakistan economy, which is sorely lacking. Pakistan economy जो है वो बस सरकारी दफ्तरों में डिस्कस होती है या कहीं भी नहीं डिस्कस होती या डोनर के दफ्तरों में डिस्कस होती है. तो हमने कहा हम जरा इसको तोड़ दें और कोशिश करें कि लोगों को भी बताएं कि कन्वर्सेशन में क्या होता है. तो वन थिंग दैट वी नोटिस्ड मिस्टर रजा जी कि our politicians, our government seems to have forgotten the economy. We are so busy trading political insults that we seem to think that the economy is an autopilot. And yes, it is an autopilot, and I must confess it should be an autopilot. But then the government interferes unnecessarily in the economy and periodically and sporadically and whimsically, so many different ways. But right now, what we are trying to do is get hold of all the Pakistani economists that we can, all the serious thinkers that we can, and try and have a conversation on what we call the forgotten and the hyper-politicized economy. जी इस पे कोई बात नहीं होती और इस पे लोग इंटरेस्टेड भी नहीं है. अगर मैं देखता हूँ तो टीवी चैनल्स पे इस पे बहुत कम डिबेट करते हैं, बहुत कम बात करते हैं. तो इट्स अ ह्यूज इशू जिसके ऊपर हमें सोचना चाहिए कि क्या हो रहा है, क्या हम कर रहे हैं. तो इस पे हम आज बात करेंगे. हमने इस पे 5-6 कॉन्वर्सेशन पहले भी किए हैं. तो आज हम सलीम रजा साहब से बात कर रहे हैं. सलीम रजा साहब, as everybody knows, is a former governor of the central bank with a long career in Citibank, and then he also joined the Pakistan Business Council, worked in that, and now he's on several boards and does many things. So we'll take up this conversation. Salim Raza साहब, पहले तो ये बताइए हमें to begin with कि जी आपके ख्याल में इस वक्त शॉर्ट रन में बड़े there's a huge amount of talk कि शॉर्ट रन में बड़े challenges आ गए हैं. Pakistan is headed towards bankruptcy. Sri Lanka is sometimes mentioned, and all kinds of scary scenarios are painted. But then we go back into the IMF program. तो ये बताइए कि शॉर्ट रन challenges के, but इसके साथ I would throw this in the hopper too कि अपना Pakistan for the last 75 years has gone to the IMF almost twice every decade. So it's a very interesting history that we don't seem to spend a decade without the IMF, 23 programs in 70 years. So that's quite a record. So with your short-term solution, can you also, ideas, can you also talk about the long-term? How can we get out of the IMF program, and what is your long-term vision? Ji, over to you, Salim sir.
Thank you very much. So the IMF programs का आपने जिक्र किया, indeed, and I suppose the context is short-term challenges. How do we engage with the longer-term challenges? The trouble is we can't seem to get around to the long term because our short-term seems to have an infinite capacity to recur, and we know why. We know why. We really don't, with our present investment levels and the structure we have of our economy, any more than 3 to 4%, which we can manage year on year. But if we get to 5% or slightly over that, we tend to run out of reserves. The rupee comes under pressure. Inflation rises. We go back to the IMF. So 13 times in the last, 24 years? No, in the last 34 years. So that we've been in the IMF programs more often than not. The reason is so 5% growth means demand outstrips our capacity to produce, to accommodate the demand. We also run budget deficits. So we also add to domestic money supply. So besides growth, there's money supply expansion, and that's what creates excess demand. Our neighbors invest more than 30% of GDP. We need to invest at least 25%. But apart from some episodes in the 90s, we haven't been able to manage more than 20%. And then there are the deficits. Now, each IMF program has asked us to do the same thing, which is collect taxes more efficiently, remove remissions and exceptions and exemptions that we put in, simplify and broaden tax collection, raise user charges or privatize. Public companies do something about circular debt. User charges is one solution. Privatization is another. Manage inflation, maintain real interest rates, etc. Now, in the 14 programs we've had, I think we've completed a full program only once. And that too with 14 waivers, 14 infractions that the IMF condoned. So, so there we are. Now we are in the throes of another program, which I think we've done well to get extended and increased.
Hmm.
But then here we are, we're going to live with it. And at the end of it, whether we will have escaped the gravity trap because we'll have done something about revenue mobilization, I don't know. So when I say structural issues, the things that will smoothen our way or ease our way to 5% plus recurring growth, I suppose everyone has their own ideas, and one could, produce a long laundry list. But just to touch on, I think let me just take four subjects. First, I think our domestic debt has become a serious joke on the government's capacity to spend. It is about 3 trillion rupees a year. It's half our FBR tax collection and overall debt. But in our debts, so 2/3 of our debt is local currency, 1/3 is foreign currency. But in our debt servicing, 90% is domestic currency cost-wise, because rates are much higher. And there's no turning back. This year, whatever deficit we end up with, 6%, 6.5%, 7.5%, whatever we end up with, this is all then going to, be addressed by more domestic debt. I'll come to the issue of debt later because it's also clogging up our banks' balance sheets. 80% of government borrowing is through banks. And this is an astronomical figure, compared to other emerging markets. More than 40-45% would be very rare. Anyway, the second, so this needs a medium-term solution, and we have to take it up. We can talk about this later. Exports. 2 points. We are an importer of agricultural imports, agricultural items, food items. $3-4 billion net negative this year is what we're going to end up at. We should be. This should actually be the other way. We should be an exporter and a growing exporter. But again, this subject has really been neglected. Right across the chain, from choice of crops, seed development, mechanization, and the development of infrastructure, cold chains, and warehousing. Now, these are things that I'm not talking about state intervention. I'm talking about state policy and supporting incentives, which appear to be that idea really doesn't seem to have caught traction in any government's thinking for the last 30 years, and probably since the 60s. Anyway, the second, what we have to bear in mind, again, with respect to exports, agriculture should begin to turn around. Second, our exports, in fact, all our production has a heavy import component. And we've got to get, before we can, liberate ourselves to, to be able to produce exports that match international standards and then develop branding and sort of recurring growth. We've got to bring our costs down. We've got to get our labor more skillful. But importantly, we also have to shift our production to intermediate goods, which at present we are importing. So spares, components, chemicals, plastics. Again, this area doesn't appear to be anyone's focus, although CPEC and the Chinese, let's take the example of the textile industry. Globally now, in exported textile items, 70% is synthetics. It's polyester, viscose, rayon, and 30% cotton. Our ratio is the other way around. China is the world's biggest producer of synthetics. We talk about CPEC, we talk about SEZs, but no one's really thought of getting some of these Chinese companies here to create a special enterprise zone for textiles alone and get the Chinese companies here with their synthetics. And there's just one thing we can do. There is so much else that we need to do in this whole area of intermediate goods. So before we can really have a sustainable export strategy leading to sort of year-on-year incremental growth, we've got to deal with the problem of imported intermediate goods and imported raw material. Lastly, we have pockets of industrialization with big gaps in domestic supply chains. We prefer to import rather than encourage our SME to support us with value chains, and this has to change. And again, the government policy here has a role to play. the fourth, I'd say, is the promotion of digital. All digital initiatives that are now underway. The good news is that here, this initiative seems to have taken off, and a lot of foreign money is coming in. Last year, I think the total was got up to about $500 million. The expectation this year is that it will be twice that. The expectation is that our digital exports, computer technology, or IT exports this year will be about 1.75 billion, and that's great. That's up from a billion last year, and if we can maintain exponential growth here, which we should be able to, this is a very hopeful. India's exports are 130. We don't have to get to 130. If we can get to 10% of that in the next 5 years, then this will be another acceleration to our imports that we don't have today. So I mentioned why we're stuck in the short term, and we can't. I don't know what the solution is. Why aren't we able to resolve this issue of simplifying tax, collecting more tax? Uh, uh, why is it that we keep stumbling at around 10, 11% of GDP, and therefore continue to run deficits? Why is it that our investment isn't going, over 14 or 15% year on year? Again, one answer to that is very simple. We have industry that is not competitive internationally. They're very happy in this protected domestic market. They really, since they don't have to meet international standards, they make do with whatever is available, and that makes them even less fit to make a big export jump. So anyway, those are my beginning observations.
No, I think those are all very valid points. But let me ask you a simple question, corollary to what I asked earlier. Okay, you say that yes, we hit a 5% ceiling, and we get a current account problem when we have a 5% ceiling. But and you rightly point out to the fiscal issues, the debt issues, and the tax issues. But then the main issue that you outline, exports, import dependence, digital agriculture, etc. These are all structural issues. It seems to me that we are so involved in collecting taxes that we forget the deep structural issues, because every time the government gets into trouble, all it does is a mini budget with more taxes and with all kinds of gimmicks. I call gimmicks because they'll go and borrow it from the market in different ways, Haque and this, that, etc. But they don't touch these fundamental structural problems. Would you say that the deep issue is the structural problem or the tax problem?
It's the lack of attention to our structural problems, which is why we are today. Now, why doesn't the government take up structural issues? One reason is that, planning, the role of the Planning Commission or the continuity of planning or state intervention in the economy to supplement and reinforce the private sector, not to replace, but to, I repeat, to supplement, to make policies, that's fallen by the wayside. Can we get our politicians to sit down and create, a central vision of an economy so that there are some inviolable, incontrovertible priorities that will not be touched, irrespective of changes in government? Hopefully, maybe, but doesn't seem very doubtful. Can we bring the Planning Commission back as a very powerful body, as almost as an autonomous body that has its plans approved by Parliament, but then is left to implement plans, through its own expertise and through its own initiatives? And could we go back to a Ministry of Finance that manages the budget instead of managing just about everything in the country to do with development and finance? Either the politicians agree that we will not divert from these priorities no matter what else, or we empower some authority. I say the Planning Commission because at one time it was almost that kind of institution, and it can be again. This is not to substitute for the private sector, but to like you said, all these things I mentioned: exports, agriculture, debt restructuring. Where do we lodge responsibility for policy to complement complementary policy for those areas? Where do we lodge policy? Our politicians haven't had time. Finance ministers with the best of intentions start off running across. Well, they start off looking for these issues. What can we do? How can we achieve structural change? But then they're swamped. They're swamped with the price of the LNG price, whether the IMF is going to agree to this subsidy or not. Should we import at $29 LNG because afterwards someone's going to ask us why we did that. These immediate the textiles, every third day, fourth day, some part of the textile chain turns up and says, "Rut gaye, mar gaye," unless you reduce gas prices or give us some form of subsidy. Our entire private sector lives off massive subsidies. This turf, which is a success in one sense, that there's been 500 billion rupees of take up. This is the subsidized long-term machinery import facility that the State Bank extended to investing clients from Pakistan in the COVID days, although it had nothing to do with COVID because it's a long-term facility at 2%. Financing rate is 2%. Now with Kaibo today at what is it, 10, 11, 12%, that's a 10% subsidy. So we take these industries and what's happened to turf? The bulk of it has gone into textile plants and into more into spinning, a little into weaving, so that we're back to yarn and cloth. It hasn't gone into garments. It hasn't gone into joint ventures with leading garment companies. It hasn't gone into skill development or anything that will give an edge to our textiles where they can compete again with the rest of the world. I don't know where we are in garments, 14th or 15th. And the number 2 is Bangladesh. Number 3 is Vietnam. Neither of them have cotton. So was this useful? I mean, what are we going to do with our big businesses who have such an influence on how policy is made? So that's one part of it. Let me give you another very concrete example of where government can do something but hasn't done, and let me go back to domestic debt. 82% of government debt, treasury bills and PIBs are placed with the banking system. So that 54%, 53% of loanable assets by banks are sitting in government securities. There's another 12, 15% of lending by banks that's government guaranteed. Some PSEs, all these IPPs, which are government guaranteed. So that leaves 33% for the rest of the market. Now, because the government is so dependent on the banks, it pays the banks a premium to borrow from banks over what banks take deposits from the market at. So if a 3-month deposit is X, a government treasury bill will be X plus 2 times X plus 3. This is absurd. It's illogical because does the government bail out banks or do banks bail out government? It should be the other way around. But then to do that, the government has to start getting out of banks and borrowing from mutual funds, trying to place this, high-yielding PIBs abroad, create domestic mutual funds, just get banks depositors, moving out of lower-paying time deposits into high-paying treasury bills, which are, through fund managers, and those fund managers can be government. NIT can become one of those. There are the enormous amount of money that the government can drag out of banks into its own mutual funds. So government's borrowing rate will come down, the rate banks pay will have to go up, and the government will then emerge as the benchmark. In other words, the low cost against which all interest rates are marked up. Now, why hasn't this been done? It's so obvious. This is what happens in most parts of the world. There are more government treasury bills. There's more US government security paper held in money market funds and mutual funds. There's about 10 times more held in funds than there is by banks. And it's the total reverse here. So does the government not understand it? Of course it understands it. But what's been done about it? Nothing. They start off trying to, as many times in the last 12 years as I've been sort of associated with this, they started off by trying to create a professional debt management office, try to give it leeway, give it authority, but then the Ministry of Finance gets distracted by other priorities. The debt management office then just becomes a window to be told by different parts of government about how much money they need, and then it, twice a month, because debt auctions are twice a month at the State Bank, it just tells the State Bank how much it wants to borrow. The whole structuring of debt, the attempt at placing outside banks, all that falls by the wayside. So that's just one example that I know about, and this is what happens, I think, with other policy initiatives. This short term is so distracting that we
But
can't
Nadeem sir,
get on.
देखिए, you've been in policy position. You were the governor of the central bank. You've been in many government meetings. I'd like to ask you to comment on the quality of discussions in government meetings. Do we have these conceptual discussions? Do we have clear ideas on what reforms to do? Are we very transactions based? ECC के जब मैं मिनट से कुछ देखता हूँ मुझे लगता है it's very transactions based. Cabinet की भी जो चीजें निकलती हैं they're very transactions based. Is a comprehensive discussion of the economy ever taking place in the government? With conceptual issues and with clear-cut things, how to set up the debt office, the strategy on debt or whatever.
No, you're right. I have to say it's the vast majority of the time these structural issues don't get attention. There's no time, there's no room to discuss them because we're dealing with things that have to be done today, tomorrow, or we're reviewing policy because some element of our business structure, some aspect of our combination of our business groups are complaining about this, that, or the other. So it is dealing. It's tactical. It's transactional. It's dealing with issues that come to you as opposed to you preempting issues. I mean, do we sit there and say, forget long-term strategy? Can we help? Can we deal with easing things for business, for simplifying things for business? Can we deal? We hear complaints about how long this procedure takes and that procedure takes and how many steps to get a license. Yeah, no, these are immediate things. This is not long-term strategy, but even issues like this very rarely come up. There is very little thinking outside stuff that comes and lands on tables.
So what would you change in terms of the policy process?
I think, well, you know as well as I do, you've been in the planning commission. Our planning commission is not what it used to be. But policy development has to be lodged in the policy continuity has to be holistic. It's got to take all our requirements into consideration. You can't have some policy being made by the Ministry of Commerce, some being made by the Ministry of Industry, some being made by the Ministry of Finance, which do not integrate into anything that is value added in a quantum sense for the economy as a whole. We can't do that. And that really all happens depending on how powerful the individual minister is. But why the hell not pull that back into the planning commission? Why is it, there's with a lot of our senior bureaucrats, you might have seen this as well, there's this view that, the best planning for us is done by the private sector. So LSM, large scale manufacturing, exports, leave that to the market. I think this was sort of fed to us and half digested by us, fed to us by, the multilaterals and the mantra of the 90s, the neoliberal mantra. So then we believe that the LSM and this export trust somehow will weave a magic. Together, these two are only 17-18% of GDP. But somehow this 17 or 18% will become the locomotive that pulls the rest of the economy. Now, it is conceivable that they could have played that role provided they developed strong internal supply chains, provided they looked to try and make parts, components, chemicals here. But they're very happy importing them from Thailand. Our motor industry, for example, the number-wise, number of items that go into a car, number-wise, we might have got to 70% deletion. Value-wise, it's the other way around. The bit that's not deleted are the more valuable items. So 70% value. But now, if you ask the motor industry, why don't you make the parts here? They will probably tell you, and in all honesty, they'll say that we import them from Thailand, which is where the Japanese set up part manufacturing capacity 30 years ago. Those guys are experts. They're the lowest cost, and even the Japanese buy their parts from there. If we went to our Japanese partner and said, put up a parts component here, they'd say, look, you're being idiotic. You just will not get your costs down to the level that you're importing them at. So maybe we've missed the boat in some instances. Maybe it's time to talk to the Chinese who are still trying to grow their auto industry, grow their export market. Maybe they'd be happy to come here and start from scratch. But the existing manufacturers aren't going to suggest that. They'll protect their turf. So, there again, we're stymied. There's no room to go forward. We don't have a naphtha cracker, So it's probably much cheaper for us to these things that I was talking about, viscose, polyester, rayon, much cheaper for us to import from Saudi Arabia or from somewhere else, where there's huge capacity and the cost, and therefore even that is blocked for us to do. So then we're locked. Unless we break the mold, we're locked into on everything in the shape of our industry today. We're locked into heavy importing.
Yeah.
The answer is breaking it out. Agriculture is something where we can change things, uh, and we can become major exporters. Digital, we can become major exporters. We can, and I think we have to select those parts of industry where the import component can either be substituted here or is not needed.
But tell me one thing. Think about it. If supposing you were in charge of policy today, how would you reprioritize, your objectives, and what kind of a approach would you use to making policy?
Well, if you're making policy in an ivory tower, then it really doesn't
For
matter.
example, let me rephrase that a little. Currently, our policy has always been one thing: increase taxes and the hell with everything else. We are always increasing taxes. With taxes, we are always increasing documentation. We've got this huge narrative of getting rid of the black economy, and the rest we don't matter. Maybe the only thing that matters is the inflation rate. So that seems to be our only priority. In fact, if I've counted the number of times we mentioned the word investment or growth in policy speeches or in other things, and they're almost negligible. We pay sideways attention to growth or investment. We never seem to discuss that. Everything, if you read EPM speeches or if you read all the major speeches, growth and investment, even the central bank, growth and investment don't seem to figure out that much. So what do you think?
Well,
should we continue to?
Well, because the government does not take responsibility for growth and investment, it really does not. What it does claim for itself, and I'm not talking about a government, I'm talking about government over the years in Pakistan, over the decades. What government does is take credit for facilitating business. The government does not take credit for developing strategy or for engineering growth. So because the government's given up this sense of responsibility for acting as a catalyst to growth. Again, you remember the state-led capitalism, state-led, not state-owned, state-led capitalism of Japan, of Korea, and more lately in China, even in India, where there's huge directed lending. And I'll give you an example about India right now. Now, maybe we can't be Korea and Japan. We don't have the clout, or the state does not have the aura that the Japanese and the Korean state had at the time of their takeoff. But certainly the state can be back in the saddle on policy and on implementation, and not just think only in terms of carrots. What carrots can we give business? Where can we subsidize them? Where can we refinance them? One good development is that the IMF has asked us as a structural benchmark, which means we've got to prepare policy for it, discuss it with the IMF, to take all refinance out of the books of the state bank and put it into a government-owned vehicle, which will have to fund itself, so that all the subsidies that the moment disappear into state bank accounting will be visible and will be shown to government. And then, once that cost appears like a rock, someone should sit and ask, we've been giving textile. The whole point of this refinance subsidy, which is very substantial, you finance yourself at 2 and 3%. In these days, I think CIBOR is 13.5, just above the policy rate is about 13. So we're giving them enormous subsidies. The total volume outstanding in refinance is about 1.5 trillion. There are also components of financing that are government guaranteed. Now, all this is all right, but there ought to be a threshold. You keep on, if your textile industry is permanently in this subsidy, then that's the wrong logic to have given. That's not the thing that belongs in subsidized finance. If we can't, after so many years of subsidized finance, something cannot stand on its own feet without a subsidy, should we carry on giving it? There has to be the kind of review. I'm talking about subsidized finance, has to have a termination date. But it doesn't seem to me that either the authorities or the borrowers see these subsidies as transient, to enable them to bolster themselves up and then run. They see them as permanent. They see it permanently as a structure of how they do business in Pakistan. So if the refinance, so we're meant to submit a paper to the IMF, it's become a structural benchmark. Once we've submitted the paper, then it will become an action plan. Then it will be, then there'll be some quantitative, it will be written into future IMF programs that now actually go out and do it. But, so the government will wake up to this subsidy and demand more from its industries. But then there's so much else where government can review the performance of our industries and ask, what has our facilitation to our industries done for us?
So who does this thinking? Who has actually ever quantified the subsidies and their role in the economy, or the impact of subsidies on? Do we ever wonder about these things? Does the Ministry of Finance or the State Bank or anybody look at this issue?
No.
For example, the issue of protection, the issue of 50 years we protected cars and we're still in the same mess. We've subsidized fertilizers for 50 years. We've subsidized so many industries. Does anybody look at these things, or should they?
I believe very strongly in the state involvement in its own with its own businesses and its own capitalists and in leadership and policy. But I think the feeling in government progressively since the 1990s is that business will lead the way. And if you talk too much, or there's no development bank in Pakistan. There is no development banking in Pakistan. There is no, forget Zarai Taraqi is very small. Forget a housing bank, it's tiny and is being privatized anyway. The SME bank has been on a respirator for the last 40 years. So there is no development bank. Now, there's no development bank. The big banks are feeding off government securities. Who's going to worry? And then for the rest of the money, they're very happy dealing with the large scale borrowers. Who's going to worry about agriculture, SME, and different types of small consumer lending? Who's going to do it? Now, in this context, let me tell you how development banking can achieve ends. And India is an example. Housing, it's a vital need. It's a national need, and it feeds lots of other industries. The housing industry, it feeds about 30 industries. India's housing loans, mortgages to GDPs was 1% about 2 decades ago. It's now 11%. Our mortgage loans were 0.3% of GDP. Now it's 0.5 with all the push that the State Bank has been giving. Still 0.5%. And it's not going to go much faster because we lack the planning environment. And what is the planning environment? What India did is allocate land. In Pakistan, land is very difficult to get. Is allocate land, state land, for housing colonies, number one. Number two, create a regulator for builders, for developers. Create a regulator, state regulators and a central regulator, so that they're forced to obey certain standards. Then they started giving targets to banks. And the banks then had a stock of transactions coming to them from land allocated by government, so no problem with title deeds, and with developers who had balance sheets, who were regulated, who had to meet certain standards. So no hesitation dealing with the developers. Here we've charged ahead and set targets for banks, but we don't have proper land allocation, and we have developers who are not regulated. And some are very good, some are medium, but if they start growing very fast and the banks can't really size them up, grade them, rate them, this effort won't go anywhere. So without land and without regulation of developers, if you're trying to build a serious housing program, it won't go very far. So that's what I mean by state planning. It's left, it's all left to the market, but the state puts in the fundamentals. Why we don't do it here? I can't answer you, but I can simply say
but then this begs the question.
These IMF programs don't allow us to step outside. And by the way, I think something else has happened. I think a big business now is strong enough to be heard first and influence policy.
Fair enough. But let me then ask you a question. What it seems to me from what you're saying is, okay, we need to figure out which is the bigger failure in Pakistan, political or technocratic. Are all these problems that you're listing, the lack of a mortgage market, the lack of a debt market, the lack of a banking market, there's so many markets that you've counted. Is that because the politicians, there's no political will? People always tell me there's no political will. Or is that because technocratically, we don't have the people who are capable of finding these solutions and making the changes?
No, I think we have the people. We have the people, and I think we have well-intentioned people in government. But first of all, because our priority is the short term, and second, as I said, because other influences on government, business elites, and we have some excellent businessmen, but let's just take business as an entity, not as individuals. Business elite carving out what they want to see. So the short-termism of the government because of the IMF programs and the influence of big business, and somehow the faith in government and this I'm very disappointed in this, but if that's how people think, good enough. The faith in government that the private sector will lead the way, and that if the government gets involved, things are going to get screwed up. Get government out of business. Well, getting government out of business is fine if the government's doing business, but getting government out of planning is not fine. However, we can't seem to make that distinction. I mean, so often I've been described as socialist when I'm asking for government intervention on development finance to support the private sector. But so you see how much thinking has shifted in favor, perhaps, of the belief that the business will lead the way. As we see, it won't. It hasn't done for 30 years. We've given business all the leeway. Where are we? We're still stuck in the 3%, 3.5% growth cap. So there is something wrong with the government stepping back so far. Definitely wrong. Will the government get confidence in itself and say we can do a reasonable, responsible, contributive job? That's the question. And that's when even the technocrats government has that are not mobilized will be mobilized. But how does government recover that faith? I think a strong planning commission, an institution in government with the authority, with the sort of authority the state bank has in terms of implementation.
One thing that I always felt when I was in the government, and I asked about it often, when are we ever going to have a conceptual meeting? And I find that that's very strange that somehow we never seem to have a conceptual meeting in the government. It's always the firefighting mode. Now, in the firefighting mode, what can the government do? So that's one big problem. But let me point to another direction, that if we talk about policy making, I'm very concerned about policymaking because sitting at PIDE, we are supposed to be researching issues, and we do a lot of research. And unfortunately, nobody in the government ever wants to read it. So is research at all important in policymaking? And if it is, do you think the ministries are doing it adequately enough? You've been the central bank governor. Central bank probably is the most research-intensive organization in the country. But in the government, I don't see any research. So how valuable is research to policy making? And should the prime minister and the key people actually spend some time looking at research, or should they always be in this firefighting mode?
I mean, it's almost, what you said is almost rhetorical.
Yeah, indeed. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, government must be in the driving seat on planning. There is absolutely no alternative. Look at ourselves over the last 30 years. We have, it'll take us at 3%, it'll take us 24 years to double our GDP. Our neighbors growing at between 7 and 8% will take 9 years to double their GDP. So the gap we have with Bangladesh and India, we're at the bottom of the totem pole at about 1,500. Bangladesh is at about 2,100, India at about 2,400. Adjusting for COVID, India had dipped below Bangladesh for a while. And this gap is going to go on growing. Now, who the hell is going to address this? The private sector in its present shape hasn't done it. That's all I'm saying. We have some excellent businessmen, let me say that again, outstanding, who can compete with anybody. But you can't say that for their industries. They can, but not their industries. So are we going to lead it to them to lead the way, or is the government going to step in? And then if the government is going to step in, how do you institutionalize the state involvement with capitalism that is needed, both at the ground level, SMEs, agriculture, and with restructuring large
Oops. The internet seems to be giving up. Miracle Salim, you'll have to rejoin. Can you rejoin?
By making more, by investing.
Sorry, you'll have to repeat that because वो बीच में internet खराब हो गया था. Go ahead, repeat it. Folks, while Salim is rejoining, please raise your hands if you want to talk. Go ahead, Ji. Go ahead. Lost you for a while.
I'm sorry, I clicked out for the second. If you look at the Chinese initially, that 4 years ago, that long paper they wrote on CPEC, which was given to us for a comments, had a very heavy focus on agriculture. It had a very heavy focus on SEZs. And I don't see the Chinese in either of those areas. We haven't utilized the opportunity we have with them. And we are a big market. Even if we become a market with Chinese goods, provided they're making some of those goods over here. Why the hell not? Because we otherwise we buy from the rest of the world and making no contribution. We're just picking up things off the shelf and selling them. At least
let me quickly raise a few questions on the central bank, Pakistan, which you headed for a while. Do you think that we understand exchange rate policy? Central bank keeps telling us that they didn't make mistakes in the exchange rate policy, but I sent you a paper. We counted 5 currency crises. And in each of those crises, our reserves dipped and we've all lost our reserves again. Now, what happens in exchange rate policy as a people or as a central bank or as a technocracy or as a political system? Do we understand exchange rate policy? Why do we always get it wrong?
You know the impossible trinity. If you have an open trade system, an open current account, then you can either fix the exchange rate or the interest rate. You can't fix both. We decided to fix the exchange rate, fix the interest rate or manage the interest rate and let the exchange rate float. Now, for different reasons, exchange rate flotations can become, a floating exchange rate can have spikes up and down. So what the State Bank has said its policy is never to try and interfere with the trend in the foreign exchange markets, but smoothen markets when necessary. So if there's a big sort of sharp fall, and you know that this fall is because of one large payment that the government department had to make, or one large outflow, whatever, and you know that the market will stabilize after that, good, intervene at that point. And when it goes the other way and the rupee becomes too strong, stronger than it should be, then start buying dollars from the market as the State Bank, so that you make the rupee a bit weaker. This is what smoothening is. You try and manage things within a band. Don't buck the trend. Don't try and catch a falling knife. If the rupee is weakening, let it weaken. But again, try and stabilize the sharp up and down movements. Now, have we done that properly? Well, 3-4 years ago, when we had fixed exchange rates at 6%, and we said we're going to have the rupee at 106. We tried to manage that for 2 years. Impossible trinity. The only way you can do that is keep your exchange rate up by borrowing money from commercial markets abroad and defending the rupee. That is absurd. So that should never happen. And we did do that in 16 and 17. Now, more lately, our exchange rate has been too volatile for me to say that smoothing is working. For example, in the past 6 months, it's varied between 169 and 187. The period between August 20 and April 21, it varied from 152 to 167. Now, it should never have come to 152 because we knew that we were in a deficit position, that we were going to have to borrow to fulfill our payments obligations on the current account. So we knew it was going to weaken. It should never have come to 152. As it came below 160, we should have started buying from the market. So then the range wouldn't have been 152, 167 in a period of 8 months. it would have been something like 164 and 158 with a narrower band. So are they? So although the philosophy is very clear, we will smoothen trends. We will not try to manage the exchange rate to any particular level. Uh, we'll follow the direction, but in a narrower band. Has that been executed successfully? No. But in the state bank's defense, I will say there's another factor, which is our inflation rate. If if we happen to have huge commodity imports coming in, because we are commodity dependent, and we have LNG cargoes coming in, big cargoes that we have to pay for immediately, then you don't mind letting the rupee get a bit weaker than it would otherwise have been, because it helps you keep domestic prices down. So sometimes you have to let exchange rate bend in order to accommodate inflation. So before I criticize the state bank, and which it would seem I'm being critical in saying that our movements, our bands have been too big. The rupee has bounced up and down in too large a band. Before I say that, the state bank does also have to take stock of inflation, and sometimes that's the reason for the rupee getting stronger than it should.
But it seems that central bank sort of wavers between using the exchange rate as a nominal anchor and letting the exchange rate go. But on balance, as we've noticed, our exchange rate has been overvalued most of our history. If you look at China and if you look at other Indian countries, we've done a survey of about 100 countries, and exchange rate is heavily correlated with undervaluation. Growth is heavily correlated with undervaluation. Most countries that have grown have had an undervalued exchange rate. Is this simple truth not visible to our policymakers?
It should be, but the reality is our import dependence. A weaker rupee suits domestic inflation. Meaning an overvalued rupee suits domestic inflation.
Yeah.
We don't have if we had a very powerful export engine, i.e. Vietnam, their exports are more than GDP. Our exports are 8% of GDP. It doesn't even have to be as big as an engine as Vietnam, even Bangladesh, with 38, 39, $40 billion of exports. Now, they can have a currency that veers to suit exporters. So, in other words, slightly overvalued. But where your bias is the other way, which is that import price levels matter much more to you than the exchange rate for your exports, because the exports are relatively inelastic and not very big, and too small as a percentage of GDP to really have much of an influence. Then you will tend to have a slightly overvalued rupee. I mean, it can't be helped; it's just arithmetic. Otherwise, your inflation gets high, and then this whole cycle starts again.
So it seems to me like it's basically lack of policy clarity that drives the exchange rate and many other things, because eventually now we've got to a situation, unfortunately, where the capital as well as the current account are fully closed. The current account is fully closed. I remember when I was young, if I wanted to buy a subscription for comic books, I couldn't get $1 from the state bank. When I wanted to apply overseas, I couldn't get money from the state bank. I had to beg somebody from overseas to give my admission fee or that application fee.
Yeah.
So I think we are getting back to that stage now where everything is closed. We can't send our money out. We can't bring our money in. So it's a bad situation. But it seems to me that most of this is from a policy failure. Now, last question before I turn to the floor. The state bank, the IMF keep pushing for the state bank to be independent. And we passed a brand new law with all kinds of independence terms. But the IMF, I'm afraid, I used to work there, but it still doesn't seem to understand our politics. That laws mean very little. We've had the debt reduction law, didn't mean much. We've had so many other laws which don't mean much. But at the same time, state bank, having gotten independence, has gotten into housing, has gotten to small industry, has gotten to all kinds of. Should the state bank be doing all this, or is this planning commission work?
No, I was referring to the state bank's concessional financing, which is what you're referring to. And where housing is partly supported with government guarantees and a low refinance rate, etc. They're doing the same thing with SMEs. The state bank has not done anything for the SMEs, and there is no development bank here. SMEs are only about 6% of total private sector lending, 7%, very small. So whatever the state bank does is tokenism. It's not going to make any difference. For housing, it's a bit more than tokenism. They are putting pressure on banks, and this is not donor funds. This is the state bank assuming that this is the government's top priority at the time. But we haven't got the environment ready to go very far with housing. We've got to make, I told you, as I mentioned to you, we've got to make other changes. We've got to make land easily available that the government unlocks from its huge holdings of land. Colossal holdings of land. But there again, you've got a problem. Karachi has 14 different land owning authorities. And there is, you stand on top of one of these hotels in the middle of Karachi, look around, there are huge open plots in the middle of the most expensive areas of Pakistan. But some is cantonment land, some is DHA land, some is customs land, some is provincial government land. And, for whatever reason, it's too difficult to sort of mobilize that land into civic use. Why not? It makes eminent sense. Let the city thicken in the center. Let it get higher in the center. It'll suit everybody. It'll cut your fuel cost. It'll cut your transport cost. There are big economics in it. There's big efficiency in it. So I agree, absolutely. Why doesn't it happen? So if you're going to go for a big, massive housing push, that's the first thing you have to sort out. And the second is the regulation of builders.
We have seen in the PID, first of all, that the government miscalculated because the World Bank miscalculated. There is not such a huge housing shortage the government thinks there is. We've also seen that everything is so heavily regulated. We've got a sludge report where we look at the regulation in the country, and the cost of regulation in just a few sectors amounts to 39% of GDP. But nobody has the time to unravel the regulation. NOCs is a major item where everybody's asking for NOCs. Every agency wants an NOC. So if you want to do anything, you have to get 10 NOCs, which will take you 2 years to get. Because you'll have to go into the office, to some office or the other. So, I mean, these are huge issues. Nobody wants to look at them. Yeah, go ahead.
On the subject of housing, let me make another observation. About half of Karachi's population lives in Kachi Abadis, and more than half the Kachi Abadis are right smack bang in the center of metropolitan Karachi. Shireen Colony, Jinnah Colony, Punjab Colony, Qaidabad, etc. Right smack bang. Now, these people have no title deeds. The property is regularized in the sense that it's there, but they have no land allocation, they have no proper title deeds. They have their own registers. The colony keeps its own register. Now, Mr. Bhutto had started the regularization of Kachi Abadis. It all came to a halt in the late 90s. You've got, like you said, the housing shortage isn't as big as it appears to be, because on paper, these people have nowhere to live. In reality, they live in Kachi Abadis. The value in Kachi Abadis, 300 square foot, ground plus 1 plus 2. In these Kachi Abadis, properties are 20 and 30 lakhs, but there's no title deed. Very often, the ground floor is a karkhana because the guy does all the repair work for the motor workshops in the area, for the people who come to have the electronic things fixed. The workshop is the ground floor in this Kachi Abadi. If you can give these guys titles, they'll be able to borrow against their property from banks.
Yeah.
And you can unleash so much money. I think the GDP can go up 1 or 2% through just regularization. And they can borrow and they can expand their businesses. And again, if you allot them land somewhere around which is lying there vacant, they can start a workshop, employment, everything doubles. At the moment, they're working with their own capital, but here they've got an asset that's immobilizable. Simply administrative, what do you want to call it? Negligence, oversight. And then we talk about more. Why not regularize these to begin with, and then let's see what the shortage is.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Okay, folks, anybody has a question, please raise your hand. There was somebody called Poco something. Anybody there like by that name? Or Wasif Rashid. Wasif, go ahead. Wasif, go ahead. Seem to have lost him. Okay. Okay.
Syed Hija. Dr. Syed Hijazi.
Okay, Hijazi Saab, go ahead. I can't see these hands for some reason. Hijazi Saab, go ahead. Hijazi Saab.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Hijazi Saab is the former vice chancellor in 3 or 4 universities. Hijazi Saab, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. It's always an eye-opening to be discussing on issues related to economy, which is we used to have rarely in some of the seminars in Marriott or whatever. And I'm very happy that some few things are opening up. I have a question to Mr. Salim Raza. That whenever we are talking about economy, we are talking about macroeconomy. We are not talking about microeconomy at all. Now, we are always talking about loan and funding and financing, and as you have rightly mentioned, that everything is done on the basis of decisions to be taken tomorrow. Secondly, I see that fiscal policy does not practically exist. We only talk about tax collection. So we don't see what happened. I've seen battery cell industry die out. I've seen split AC industry die out. I've seen so many industry because there was no incentives given to them. I just want to know that do you think that like the Chinese are more focusing on microeconomy and micro employment, and in Pakistan we are not thinking at all about that? Is it okay to just go on and think about macro level and assuming that everything will be okay by just thinking about the broader picture and everything will get fixed?
जिन्हें बिल्कुल I agree with you. जैसे मैं कह रहा था, हम समझते हैं कि हमारी जो LSM है, which is 7, actually it's not even 9, it's 7.5% of GDP. कि वो एक किस्म का इंजन है जो बाकी इकोनॉमी को साथ लेके चलेगा, और नहीं हो रहा है जैसे मैं कह रहा हूँ इंटरमीडिएट गुड्स वो बाहर से मंगवा रहे हैं. तो ये जो the middle of the economy and the base of our economy, it's not integrating with what we think is our leading engine. So it's not our leading engine, and the rest of the economy is then on its own. Let me give you I'll tell you where I have big hope. I have big hope in what digital might do, and I'll tell you why. हमारे deposits है 19 trillion. So it's one of the smallest banking systems around, 30% of GDP. So our deposits are about 19 trillion, and our cash in circulation is about 7.5 trillion. So that's 40%, about 40% of deposits. There is no country in the world that I've come across where cash is more than 20% of deposits. In any developed countries, it's 5% of deposits. अब ये जो डिजिटल दुनिया में हो रहा है, जो हमारे यहाँ अब होना शुरू हुआ है, and this is all private sector. This is all small guys, and ये हमारे fintech के experts ये कर ही रहे हैं. Let me give you, they're working on many fields, but let me give you one simple example. इस वक्त हमारा FMCG है, fast moving consumer good manufacturer. He sells to distributors, they sell to sub-distributors, sub-distributors sell to big department stores and to hundreds of thousands of retailers. अच्छा, ये पूरी chain में there is financing. क्योंकि retailer पैसे कहीं से raise करता है, buyer पैसे कहीं से raise करता है, sub-distributor को पैसे की जरूरत पड़ती है. Because the FMCG has to be, the manufacturer has to be paid cash. So इस पूरी chain में there's a lot of credit, market credit. Now, what these people are doing, these fintechs, that they are sizing up all the players. There's one fintech I know, they have credit data on 500,000 people in this chain that I'm talking about, that comes from the manufacturer down to the retailer, and sometimes to the buyers from the retailer who are given credit. So they've got data on 500,000 people. ये लोग 15 दिन में पैसे देते हैं, ये 30 दिन में देते हैं, ये 40 दिन में देते हैं. इन नामों पे सवालात है, कभी पैसे नहीं दिए, उन्होंने मिस कर दिया. अच्छा, now the people who have credit records that are credible, उनको ये package करके they will finance them. They'll come to banks to finance them, or they are looking at doing what India did. India took this financing that is within supply chains, they created an exchange where such credit that's within supply chains is rated, because you have the rating, you have the 1 year record, 2 year records of these people in terms of making payments. तो वहां से वो निकाल के लाते हैं और exchange पे quote करते हैं as bundles. So they put together thousands of names and they put a bundle of ₹1 billion on the exchange. These people pay high interest rates. Informal market में 32% देते हैं, 40% देते हैं. So this credit that's in the chains now comes outside the informal market into the formal market. It's bundled. It's put somewhere where you can bid, and you'll get much higher rates than you get from banks because these people are paying much higher interest rates. अगर वो 40% दे रहे हैं, आप उनको 18% पे उनका पेपर खरीद लें, they're much better off. So this is just one example. It's happening in many ways. So in this way, the fintechs are dragging the informal market into the formal market for financing. And this sort of thing will start reducing this cash that I was talking about. So हमारा 7.5 trillion cash, अगर 1 trillion से reduce हो जाए, तो 1 trillion banks में आ जाएगा. जब banks उस पैसे को lend करेंगे into the market, that 1 trillion will become a deposit in a second bank. वो बैंक आगे उसको लेंड करेगा, तो जो बैंकिंग मल्टीप्लायर कहलाता है, this 1 trillion can become 3 trillion. So what digital can achieve for us is over time, it can achieve a significant reduction of the cash in the informal economy, bring that into the formal market, and expand the size of our formal market, expand our deposits so that the banks now have more money to lend. Is सबसे पहले the government will have to start getting out of the books of banks. If 52% to PIBs or treasury bills में लेके बैठे हुए हैं, they can't do this. They shouldn't do this to the banking system. They should borrow from public markets. So that's one direction we should go in as well. But again, you're going back to digital. I think what digital can achieve for us is going to be very, very interesting in the years to come. And now this, by the way, my one prayer is that the government does not attempt to regulate these digitals.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said
one thing it must not do is try and regulate them and forget about taxes for the next 5 years. Let them get much, much bigger.
असल तो ये बात है सलीम साहब, असल तो बात ये है, the government must get out the business of trying to tax everything to death. For example, I'll give you a simple example. Tell me what's wrong with this. I have a friend who sold a property. The government has a DC rate. In fact, we just written a paper on this and we've talked about this. Why does the government have a DC rate? Why does the government have an FPR rate, right? There is ways of disclosing the price of the property very easily if you use the internet, but no, they have to have a DC rate and FPR rate. So my friend sold the property for, let's say, 2 crores. And the guy came along, the seller came along and said, the DC rate is 1 crore. I'll give you 1 crore in the bank, 1 crore in cash. Now, my friend was left with a choice. Either drop the price of the property or take 1 crore in cash and put it in the locker. And that's what he did. Now, the problem is that lots of people are holding cash because of the very simple fact that we don't want the cash to come back into the system. This nonsense about black cash, I don't understand that this is black, this is black. We have to begin to understand that money needs to circulate. 1. 2, we also need to understand this whole business about documentation, that there is a certain amount of documentation. I'm already fully documented. Everybody that I know is fully documented because everything I do is on CNIC, right? Now, this friend also, when he sold the property, he took a full receipt and he took the cash and put it in the bank. Now, if the FPR wants to look the other way and just keep telling people that ye problem hai, I think we have to straighten out our system. My feeling is that everywhere we have a huge technocratic problem because nobody has the capacity to think through the problem. We're not a problem-solving government. We are a firefighting government. How would you react to that?
No, I agree. I agree. We're reactive and we're firefighting. You know, you mentioned this land example. So he's ended up in cash in the locker, frozen money. He might buy land with it. That's the other thing people do. Yeah. Because again, he will buy much more. He'll buy 10 crores worth and show 1 crore expenditure. So now he shifted his wealth into land. So which at a huge undervalue, ये जो अभी दी थी amnesty to developers, ताकि they bring all their land out. I thought that would be accompanied by a rationalization of land prices. कि चलो तुमने कर लिया, जमीन तुमने अंडर वैल्यू पे खरीदी थी, अब here is your chance to declare it and do something with your wealth. But that second part didn't seem to happen. So it's just given developers to bring pockets of land they own into development and make a lot of money out of it without releasing pockets of land into the market, which is what should have happened if land prices had been rationalized. And then, the other thing is people buy a lot of gold here. Our savings are not small. We can't measure our savings. If our cash is as big as this, 7.5 trillion, God knows how much gold our holdings of gold are. Our holdings of dollars, cash dollars.
But Salim, there's
that
another
doesn't
problem
get
that I'd
measured.
like to. एक और मैं आपको प्रॉब्लम बताऊं, बड़ा मजेदार है. सेवर बेचारा करे क्या? अब देखिए ना, we are so market averse. Stock market, you mentioned the money market, but look at the stock market. Stock market has not grown in the last 30 years. It remains at 20% and 20% of GDP. And also the liquid market is even smaller because lots of dead stock still remains in the stock market. Isi tarah koi class le le, there are no asset classes in which to invest. So the only asset class available to saver is land. And now a new asset class has been created, which my last guest told me about, which is very interesting, the asset class of cars. People are buying expensive cars primarily to save in them and hedge against the dollar. So we've set up a very strange economy where there are no asset classes. What do people do?
Absolutely right.
Stock market में हमने एक पेपर किया है कि stock market, Mahbub Alag said कि जी 22 families own the stock market. Today it's 31 families. 31 families own the stock market, and the board of governors are really, honestly, not more than the Sindh Club and Punjab Club member list. It's a bunch of cronies. So, I mean, we are averse to setting up a market. And when we set up a market, we have no tough love. The regulator will not let anything die because they want everything to survive. So you have sick industries. I mean, sick industry is a term that I can't get my head around. I mean, why don't we have bankruptcy laws? We've been talking about it the last 60 years and we can't even have bankruptcy law.
Yeah.
So it's bizarre. I don't know if anybody is managing the till or not.
No, this bankruptcy laws, I was involved with it as well 12 years ago, as you might have been 20 years ago. And the thing gets done, it gets approved, it even gets to parliament, and then somewhere it gets twisted out of shape. You introduce a horse and it comes out as a donkey or an elephant, and then it's not usable because the twisting was done for God knows what reason by people who didn't understand what they're doing. But there are so many companies here in court because banks have taken them to court. And the cases are going to take 12 years. In the meantime, the value of land is rising. So the owner doesn't care because he strips the assets he wants and he sits there in court while the price of land rises. Eventually, he makes a bundle on the land, pays the bank off. He's done no business, but he's made a hell of a lot of money. Now, if there was proper Chapter 11, there's proper the whole point about Chapter 11, very misunderstood. It's not a bankruptcy law. It's a law that primarily tries to revive a business. What price can it work at and become profitable again? So it's got to be mark to market. The banks have to take a bit of a haircut. Banks maybe even have to put in equity again. But a business survives, job survives, and this business may do well in the future. That's the bigger part of bankruptcy in America. Then there's also Chapter 9 and Chapter 7, which are pure wind-ups. But most of Chapter 11, which is this sort of reconstruction of business that's in bankruptcy. And there are experts, the judges or the people who run bankruptcy courts are experts themselves and they involve experts. And most companies come out and survive. But in here, you go into a court with the bank, if you want your money back, you as the investor, you just wait till the land prices rise enough and then pay the bank off 10 years later, 12 years later. So and the lawyers do very well, and you do all right. And the company the business goes to hell, and business goes to hell, and the jobs go to hell, and the machinery goes to hell.
You're absolutely right. We looked at the job market, and the job market looks in terrible shape. 31% of graduates are unemployed. 34% of the youth are discouraged workers. Graduate premium does not exist. The high school premium is virtually flat. So quite frankly, the job market looks terrible. And we have been talking about this in the PIDE, that one of our economic words, which is very important, our key economic word is relief. I don't think any other country uses this. कि हमने relief देनी है. तो relief is only a Pakistani word. हमने बड़ी कोशिश की है कि relief को बदल दें into opportunity. But our kids have no opportunity, and we've also checked into this. Some professors tell us that the youth is very depressed because they feel they have no hope in the future. So there are lots of things that are wrong. But thank you, Salim Saab. You've given us a wonderful discussion today. Lots of food for thought. This series is really meant much more for students to gain ideas and talk to people like you. So we thank you for that. And this has been a wonderful discussion. Inshallah, we'll take it up again with somebody soon.
Inshallah.
All the best, Ji.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, participants. Khuda Hafiz.